everyone, welcome back to Country Cow Designs. I'm Jo, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make our newest pattern, the Teloujay 3. Now, over the past few months, if you follow our channel, you'll notice we've been doing like a men's backpack and a no-sew leather tote. So we've been doing things that are quite different, outside of our norm. So today we are going back to the basics, back to the fan favourites of a little crossbody. We have noticed that little crossbodies are generally everybody's favourite. So this is the Teloujay 3. This doesn't replace the Teloujay 1 or 2. It's more like when you go to see your favourite film and then they bring out a sequel. So we started off with the Teloujay 1, which is our discounted pattern for a small crossbody bag. This was really, really popular. Now this one, it had an exterior slip pocket, it's got a rectangular base, it's got card slots in the interior zip pocket, and it's got a magnetic snap at the top. So once we'd done the Teloujay 1 and that was so popular, we figured we'd make a second version, which again is discounted. So this is the Teloujay 2. It has a different style strap. It has an oval base. It's got a different exterior construction. It's got a recessed zip at the top. It's got an exterior zip pocket and an exterior slip pocket. So as you can see, quite different to the first one. And the third one is different again. We've got an exterior slip pocket. We've got a different base construction with box corners. We've got a zip top closure that closes all the way at the top. And inside we've got a zip pocket. So this isn't to replace the others. The similarities between the Teloujays is that they are all beginner-friendly, simple crossbody patterns. Now, they're not going to be the easiest patterns you've ever done. The idea is that we want to, come up with new skills and new ideas. So it's not going to be the simplest bag you've ever made because you're going to be learning some skills along the way. That's the whole point of these patterns, and we hope that you will really enjoy doing that. The Teloujay 1 and the Teloujay 2 were released in 2020 and 2021, so we knew we had to do a third one for 2022, and we hope that it's going to be just as popular as the first two. So at the time of this video, all three of these patterns are just £2 each. They include this full video tutorial, step-by-step photos, pattern pieces to print at home. So we really hope that you guys are going to think that it's worth it. We've put a lot of effort into making sure that these bags are really quick to make and really enjoyable and come out in really high quality bags. So we hope that you guys will think that's worth it. The patterns are each available from our website, countrycowdesigns.com. If you need hardware and zippers, we do sell those as well, and also some webbing for straps and things like that. So just go ahead and check out the website if you haven't already. And if you have any questions while we're making this bag, please drop them in the comments. Let us know if you like the video, if there's anything you'd like us to do again in the future, anything that you'd like to see us change. Any feedback whatsoever, we love to hear it, so please go ahead and leave it. And if you like this video, just give it a thumbs up. So now we'll get started and we will get to making this Teloujay 3. So before we start, I'll just go through the pattern pieces. Now, if you're printing out the pattern pieces, what you need to do is join them where the symbols are. And you match them up so that they're right up against each other and then sellotape them together. So don't overlap the pattern pieces, you're just matching it up like this. So there's a few of the pattern pieces that need to have joins in them. And then you just use these to cut out all of your fabrics. So I've got my main zip, which we actually don't want to have the zip pull on until later. So that's for the top of the bag. I've got my interior zip pocket zip. These are my little strap squares, so these are optional. If you're going to have them, like it says in the pattern, they need to be cork, vinyl or leather because they're going to have their raw edges on show, so cotton just won't work. That's my zip pocket facing for my interior zip pocket. And those are my two zip pocket pieces. So this is what I'm using for my lining fabric. Now, if you want to use non-woven interfacing, because you can see all my cotton pieces have woven interfacing on them. If you want to use non-woven, you can use that on the pockets and the zip pocket facing. You could use it on straps, things like that. But I don't recommend using it on the main body of the bag because non-woven interfacing has like a crispier sort of papery finish and you just don't want that on the exterior of the bag. Now this is going to be my strap along with some webbing, and that's my exterior pocket piece. these are my 2 strap connectors. I recommend using something like cotton for these because they will get a bit bulky. So if you're on a domestic sewing machine and you're using cork or vinyl for these, you will start to feel the bulk. My base is going to be made of this tobacco cork, and I've got my base stabilizers there. So the pattern calls for Decaville Light. You can use something else if you prefer. There's lots of alternatives that would just work fine. You know, they're not exactly the same, but they'll have the same sort of effect, and that would be foam or Peltex or something along those lines. Now I've got my Peltex for my base stabilizer. That's right in the bottom to firm that up. My lining pieces, which each have 2 layers of woven interfacing. So this is important because otherwise the body of your bag won't have enough stability. So we've got 2 layers on the lining pieces. This is the exterior pocket for the outside portion in cork, and for the main portion of the bag I've got this lovely lemon fabric that I got from Spoonflower. So this bag requires very little hardware. So I've got my 2 D-rings, I've got 2 swivel hooks and a slider. So those are all for the crossbody strap. If you want to add rivets as we go, feel free to do so. And then I've got my webbing for the strap. So we're doing a 2-sided strap. We're gonna have webbing on one side and we're gonna have fabric on the other. So I've just got this lovely 1-inch cotton webbing. So for step 1, we're making the strap. What you're going to need for this is your webbing, your strap hardware, so that's your D-rings, swivel hooks and slider, your 2 strap connectors. These will be slightly narrower if you're using 3/4 inch D-rings, but it's exactly the same method, so don't worry about that. And then you're going to need your strap piece. Now, I didn't have a piece that was long enough, so I'm just going to show you how to join this first of all. So I cut 2 pieces, and in total I've added an extra 2 inches onto it as well, just to make sure it's nice and long, because we're going to lose a little bit of length here. So what we're doing is we're just putting these 2 pieces right sides together at a 90-degree angle. And then I'm just going to mark where this underneath one is. And we need to draw a diagonal line to join those marks. Now I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew this, and I'm going to make sure that I backstitch well on both ends. Okay, once that's sewn, I'm just going to trim that back a bit. And I'll take that over to the iron, and I'm going to give it a good press open, because we don't want this bulk to fall to one side. That'll just kind of clog up the strap. So I'm going to give that a little press over with the iron. Now I'll set that aside just for a minute, and we'll make our strap connectors first. So what I've done is I've marked them on the center, as you can tell. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this into that center line. And again, you could press this with an iron if you have one. Now you'll notice that my interfacing is not sticking very well. It does not like this fabric, but that's not really a problem. Okay, so once you have got those edges folded into the center, we just want to top stitch these long edges. Make sure you're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, because we'll be using an 1/8 inch seam allowance on this in a moment. Okay, so that's both of your strap connectors top stitched. Now what we're going to do is wrap them around D-rings. So I'm just going to mark them down the center to start with. So this is on the wrong side, the side that has the seam. And then I'm going to wrap this around, and what I want to do is bring these raw edges to meet each other and have the D-ring on one side. So if you need to move your center line because your D-ring is a little bit thicker than mine, that's absolutely fine. And I'm going to stick it down with some double-sided tape. So with double-sided tape, you just want to make sure that you're using tape that your machine can handle. Quite often it can be to do with the needle that you're using. If you use Microtex needles, I use them quite a lot for cork and wax canvas and things like that. You will generally find that they don't like attract the glue from the double-sided tape. So just bear that in mind. If you're having trouble finding a double-sided tape that doesn't gum up your needle, it might actually be your needle that's the problem. Okay, so brought those edges to meet each other. So you can see on this side, we've got a nice, neat, finished strap connector. So I'll do the same with the second one and set those aside. Okay, so grab your main strap piece. This is the fabric piece. And what you want to do is fold the short ends in by about 1/2 inch. It's not really important exactly how much, but just make sure that short end is folded in. And then we are going to draw a line down the center. So make sure that it's down the center of the strap, because your strap is not actually going to be 2 inches. So depending what size strap you're going for, because if you wanted to, you could do a strap that's even thinner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line down the entire center, and then I'm going to fold these edges in. So these long edges are going to be coming into that center line. Right, once that's all folded in, grab your webbing. Now I have just zigzag stitched the end of my webbing because I'm using cotton webbing. If you use a matching thread, you won't see that at all. If you're using nylon, you can just melt the end. Because I didn't have a matching thread, I think I'm going to put strap ends on. But first of all, we will fit our top piece. So what we're going to do is we're going to position it centrally on top. Now, you can use fabric glue or double-sided tape or something like that to hold this in place if you prefer, but I'm just going to clip mine. So I'm clipping the wrong side of the fabric to the webbing. And because we cut this slightly smaller in the pattern, it means that we're going to have a little bit of webbing showing on each side. So it's just a sort of accent. Okay, so I've just clipped the top and I'm going to put the rest of the strap in place as we're sewing it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sew these long edges with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and the short edges. So I'm just going to start up here, and then what I'm going to do is sort of put it in place as I'm sewing it. Okay, so once that is sewn, we just need to fit the hardware to our strap. So we're going to fit the strap slider first of all. I'm just going to push this up and over that middle bar. Now, if you're sewing it, you just want to sew a square here and an X to hold that in place. If you're riveting it and you want this raw edge completely hidden, you could fold that over and then put a couple of rivets through there. You'll probably need long post rivets if you're using cotton webbing like I am. Or an alternative, if you want to just hide this edge, is you can put strap ends on. So strap ends are just these little things that you pop on the end of your strap and then you just screw them in, and that will completely hide the end of the strap. So it's really personal preference and depends on whether you're using rivets or not as to what you want to do. But I would recommend folding this back by 1 to 2 inches, whatever is your preference, and then stitching this in place. Okay, so I've decided I'm going to just use a couple of rivets on mine. So I've got this little rivet template, which is quite handy. It's got different size straps, and just make sure that you get your placement nice and centered. And then I think this is called a Japanese hole punch, but I'll link all of my tools in the description, and you just punch a hole through like that. So I'll just set that on my hand press and then we'll move on. So don't worry if you don't have the tools for rivets, just sew that in place, it's not a problem. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to grab this free end of the strap. I'm going to put it through a swivel hook, and you want your swivel hook to be on the fabric side. Then you're going to go back through the slider. Now if your slider doesn't fit, you can get wide mouth sliders. So we sell those on our website as well as the standard ones. So depending on the materials you're going to use, you might need a wide mouth one. Okay, so that's how you should have it now. And the free end needs to go through the remaining swivel hook. And again, we're just going to fold that back. If you want to add a strap end, do that now. And you can either sew that or you can rivet that in place. Okay, so once your second swivel hook is on, that's your strap all done. So set that aside and we're ready to move on to step 2. Step 2 is the exterior. You're going to need your 2 strap squares if you're having them, your 2 strap connectors that you already made, your slip pocket pieces, so that's an exterior and a lining, and your 2 main exterior panels. So we're just going to work on those 2 main panels to begin with. Now, one of these is slightly bigger than the other, so you just want to work out which one's the smaller one and set that smaller one aside. So with the bigger one, you need to have the short edge at the top, and you want to mark the center and 1/2 inch to either side and the center on the bottom. So I've already marked mine. Now what we're going to do is put one of these strap connectors on. So I've got some double-sided tape on the back. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure it's centered using that mark. And I'm going to place it 2 inches down. So if you just use your ruler, you can make sure that it is 2 inches from the top. And you just want to make sure that's nice and straight. Stick that in place. If you're using wax canvas or something like that, you may have to use a bit of fabric glue instead. Now, while I'm doing that, I'm also going to do the same thing on this smaller piece. But for the smaller piece, we need to make sure that we have the long edge at the top. So these are going to be opposites like this. So the smaller piece, we've got the long edge at the top. I'm going to place this 2 inches down. And I'm going to sew both of these on at the same time. We're going to sew this with an 1/8 inch seam allowance, a nice box just here. I'm going to get as close to the D-ring as I can, and to do that I'm going to use my hump jumper. Then I'm going to sew an X through here as well. Okay, so if you are just having these connectors and you're not putting the squares on top, I would recommend having like a small piece of Decaville or something, gluing it to the back before you sew this, just to kind of give it something extra to hold on to. It's nice to have like as much security as possible around your strap connectors. If you're using strap squares, then this is going to be another thing that's holding it down, so it's probably going to be fine without. Now for my strap squares, I am using cork. So what I like to do with cork is just use a bit of heat on the edges, because sometimes it can kind of go fluffy and that just prevents it from happening. So that's how I do that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to place this right on top so it's centered and nice and close to that D-ring, so that the stitching that we already did is hidden. And I'm going to sew this on with an 1/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. So I'll use a little bit of double-sided tape to hold this in place while we sew. So that's both of our strap squares attached. You'll notice that I backstitch on these. I know a lot of people prefer to pull their threads through to the back so they're not showing. For some reason, I always have problems with that, with my stitching coming undone, even if I've quadruple knotted it on the back. So I now just prefer to backstitch. If you're nervous about this, I would use a matching thread, because then if there's any imperfections in your stitching, it won't show. So at this point, I'm gonna fit a rivet on these. I haven't done on any of my others, but I'm going to add a rivet here. So that's completely optional, as is the strap square. You know, if you don't want to do that, that's fine too. Okay, so I've added my rivets, and on the back I put a bit of Decaville light, just because I love to have something behind my rivets, and I figure you can't have too much, you know, security on these strap connectors. So if you're ever setting rivets like this, you can just use a bit of Decaville light or Peltex or foam, whatever you've got lying around. Just something to give it something extra to hold on to is just always a good thing. So set those aside and grab your pocket pieces. And we're going to take this long straight edge at the top, place it right sides together, and we're going to sew that top straight edge. Okay, so once those are sewn together, you need to turn this out, and what we're going to do is kind of press this seam open. Now, if you're using all cotton fabrics, you can just get the iron on this, but because I'm using cork, I'm going to press it with my fingers. And we need to get a nice, neat top edge here so that we can top stitch it. So I'll clip this in place. So we're going to top stitch this edge with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then we're going to baste these three sides with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So throughout this pattern, we'll be using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance for the standard sewing, and an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance whenever we're top stitching or basting. The difference with basting is simply that you can use your longest stitch length and you don't need to backstitch. That's because basting stitches are just holding it in place until it's sewn again later. Okay, so grab your slightly smaller exterior piece. So you can see that that's not the right one. So this slightly smaller exterior piece is the one with the long edge at the top, and you can put your slip pocket on and you can see that it will fit reasonably. Now, the pocket is wider at the top. It is designed to be wider at the top, so don't panic. What we're going to do first of all is clip the bottom of the pocket and the exterior together. Okay, and then you can just match up one side at a time, because the pocket's going to kind of stick out. Now, once the bag's complete, you won't notice that the pocket is sticking out. But if we don't do this, then what happens is it kind of pulls on the exterior behind it, and it doesn't look so good. Okay, so just match up that second side. Okay, so now your pocket's going to be bulging in the middle. We're just going to baste these three edges to keep this in place. So when I'm sewing this pocket on, I'm going to start at the bottom in the middle, and then I'm going to work my way along the bottom and up one side. Then I'm going to do the same thing again in the opposite direction. So when you're sewing the second way, it's going to feel a little bit alien, because it kind of feels like you're sewing it backwards and the machine's in the way. But by doing this, it means that your pocket will end up equal on both sides, whereas otherwise you can kind of end up with this side shifting down a bit, this side shifting up, and altogether it's a little bit wonky. So grab your other exterior piece, and on the back you need to mark your seam allowances down these two sides. Then what we're going to do is we're going to place these right sides together. So you just want to match up this diagonal edge. And what we need to do is match up the seam allowance that we've marked. So it's going to end up a little bit offset, because this seam allowance mark needs to meet this edge. So you don't want it like this. You need to make sure that the seam allowance mark is matching the edge. This way we'll end up with a completely straight panel when we're finished. Okay, so you should have the same sort of thing down here, that this seam allowance mark is going to meet this edge. and it means you'll have a little bit overlapping on this side as well. Okay, so we're just going to sew that seam allowance. Okay, if like me you're using a thick fabric for your pocket, I've got cork, you're going to have a little bit of bulk there. You might need to use your hump jumper to get over that. You might also want to change to a bigger needle at this point. So fold this back, give it a little press, and what we're going to do is we're going to top stitch this seam allowance. Now when we do the other side, we're going to top stitch it as a tube stitch. If you don't like tube stitching, you know, if you struggle with it, I recommend using a matching thread here, because then you can use a matching thread on the other side when you're tube stitching. So we're just going to top stitch through this with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so you see how your panel is totally straight at the top? That's because we matched the seam allowances, so that's why we drew the seam allowance on, because then it means that we end up with a nice straight panel. If you don't do that, you kind of end up with like a step between your panels, and that can be annoying later on. Okay, so bring the other side across. Now this is going to feel more difficult because this doesn't naturally want to sit together. So we're going to put it right sides together. And again, we need to match those marks. So that mark needs to match this edge. And you might want to use some extra clips on this side because it's going to be sort of fighting you. Okay, so now we're going to sew through this with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So you're just sewing along the seam allowance that you marked. Okay, so here's where we're going to be doing a tube stitch, because now that's sewn, you need to kind of press that edge like we did with the other side. And we're going to be top stitching that edge. So what you're going to need to do is kind of stitch right through this tube. Now, if you have cotton and things like that, this is going to be much easier because you can just crumple it up and get it through your machine. And this is, you know, why it's kind of great that we don't have any stabilizer on this exterior, because it is going to make it easier. So just take your time. Every time you need to readjust, make sure that you leave your needle in before you lift your presser foot up. Or even if you're not lifting your presser foot up, just make sure you leave your needle in. It will make sure that you stay exactly where you were as you're kind of maneuvering things. Okay, that is the main part of your exterior done. So just turn that out so you can see that it's top stitched on both sides of the exterior. Okay, step 3 is completing the exterior, and for this you will need your main exterior, your 2 base pieces, both of which should have some Decaville light on the back, and your top zip. So place your 2 base pieces right sides together, and then we're just going to clip them to keep them in place. So we're just going to sew these sides with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to press the seam open, and I'm just going to top stitch each side of the seam. That's optional. If you don't want to top stitch, you don't need to. I just find it gives a slightly neater finish. Okay, so once your face seams are done, what you need to do is put these right sides together with the exterior. So you're just matching the straight edge of the base to the bottom edge of the exterior. Now, you should have center marks on your exterior pieces, so you can match those to the seam here and just clip that in place. Okay, so once you've clipped your center seams, you can clip the rest together, and now we're going to sew this with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, if you have a domestic machine like me, you can just remove the table and sew this around the arm, which is nice and easy. If you are using a flatbed machine, you'll have to sew it sort of from the inside. Okay, so once that's sewn, what we need to do is pull the base down. Okay, so what we need to do is sort of push the seams down toward the base, and what we want to do is top stitch through the base. So if you haven't already, you're going to want to change to a bigger needle. Now, I've got cork for my pocket and cork for my base, so this is a lot of layers. I'm going to change to a size 110 needle to get through this. So just bear in mind whatever fabrics you're using, and then, you know, use the suitable size needle. Now, if you're using a domestic machine like me, again, you can take your table off and just pop it on, and we can sew through this quite easily. If you're using a flatbed machine, you're going to need to turn your bag inside out in order to top stitch this. So another tip if you're using a domestic machine is usually you can move the needle over. So for me, I use the center mark on my presser foot, and then I move the needle over to the right, and that gives me a nice easy top stitch, because generally we top stitch to the left, so it can feel a little bit weird doing it on that side. So once you're happy with that, just turn this inside out. So I do recommend, especially if you're new to bag making, using matching thread, because it really helps. So I'm using a contrasting thread for this bag because it makes it clearer for this tutorial, but I really do love matching threads. It helps give like a nice neat finish, even if you kind of mess up your top stitching. So once that's inside out, we need to match up the bottom edge of this base. So we're just going to clip the bottom together there. Once that is clipped together, we're just going to sew the bottom with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that bottom edge is sewn, what you want to do is kind of press this base seam open, because then we can match up this base seam to the side seam. So you just want to make sure it's open when you're clipping it together. So what we're doing is we're boxing this corner here, and if you add extra clips down the sides, it will just help the whole thing keep its shape. It will make it much easier to sew. So you do the same on the other side, just press that seam open and just match those seams together. So they should be perfectly matched, and you should have a nice neat corner. Okay, now we're going to sew both of these box corners with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so that is how your box corners are going to look, and you'll notice that after I sewed the first seam, I then did another one right behind it within the seam allowance. That's just to try and make sure that the stitches don't show on the outside, that it sort of strengthens the seam. But I didn't do that on the base because we needed to press the seam open, and you'll struggle to press the seam open if you've got 2 lines of stitching. So I'm just going to set that aside, and we're going to get our zip ready. Now I realise that I'm getting more and more plasters as I go through this. I swear, bag making is not that dangerous. I am just having one of those days where I burnt myself with a hairdryer, cut myself whilst cutting lunch, all sorts of things. So it's definitely one of those days. Now, if you're using nylon zip, what you can do to stop the ends from fraying is use a lighter. And you can kind of just melt the end very lightly, and that stops it from fraying. So you need to mark your zip 1 inch in on each end, and you want to make sure that they match. So if your zip's slightly diagonal like mine, just make sure that the top is straight and then make sure the marks match. Now on one end of the zip, we're going to open this up, and what you're going to do is you're going to pinch on the mark. So you just want to pinch it, and it will create a 90-degree fold. And then we're going to just sew that in place. So I struggle to do this on the sewing machine because it just wants to slip out of the way while I'm doing it. So I'm just going to do it by hand. Okay, that's how your zip should now be looking. So you're going to unpeel this and grab your bag and turn it so it's right sides out. Okay, and what we want is we want the zip to close on this side, so it's on the opposite side to the pocket. That just means that if you've got like a fancy cool zip pull, that it's not going to be like, you know, on the busy side of the bag. It's going to get all of the show on this side. So what we want to do is grab one of these, and one of them will fit like this, so that the turned teeth are above this D-ring and the flat edge is on the flat edge of the bag. The other side will not. So this is the one we want. Now you should have your 1/2 inch marks, and what you're going to do is put the teeth directly on top of the right hand mark. Okay, so you want it perfectly lined up, and then just clip that in place. So you want to clip it up to the 1/2 inch mark on the other end of the bag, because when we get there, we're going to stop and we're going to turn the zip. So what you want to do is baste this on, but I am going to back stitch a little bit just over the teeth to hold them in place. I'm going to baste this on across here, and then once we get to this mark, we're going to put the needle in, lift the presser foot, and then fold the zip down toward the exterior of the bag. Okay, so it is important that you get it sort of on that 1/2 inch mark. That's going to mean that your zip is going to be nice and snug later on. You're not going to have like a big gap. Okay, so what we're going to do next is the same thing on the other side of the bag. So you're going to line up those turn teeth on top of that 1/2 inch mark. Now, because these marks are 1/2 inch from the center, you're now going to have an inch gap between them. So I'm just going to transfer my mark so that it's on the inside as well. And the reason I'm going to do that is because on this side, I'm going to sew it from the inside. That's because I find that zips always stretch just a little bit. So if I sew this from this side, which is the way that I would naturally want to sew it on my machine, I'd find that this would kind of move, and I don't want that to happen, because I want this inch gap to stay here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew it on my machine like this. I'm going to sew it from the inside, and then when I get to the mark, I'm going to do the same thing and fold the zip down into the bag. Okay, so that's how your zip should be looking. Now that was slightly more awkward from that side, but you can absolutely do it. And you can see now that my marks here are where the zip's pointing down into the bag. What I'm just going to do is I'm actually just going to clip these to that D-ring. And that will mean that they just sort of stay together and stay pointing down into the bag like we want them to. Step 4 is the lining. For this step, you're going to need your number 3 zip, your 2 zip pocket pieces, your zip pocket facing, and your 2 main lining panels. So the first thing you want to do is mark your zip pocket facing. There's a diagram on the pattern piece that shows you what you need to do. And then on one of your main lining panels, you want to mark it 2 inches down from the top and mark the center. Then what we're going to do is we're just going to line this up, match up the center marks, match up the top line, and pin it into place. If you're using something like waterproof canvas where the pin marks will show, make sure that you pin inside this center box, and then it won't be a problem. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew the rectangle. I'm going to start about here, because if you start on a corner, it can be difficult to match it up and get a neat corner. As I approach each corner, I'm going to reduce my stitch length. Normally I use about a 2.5. I'm going to change it down to a 1 as I come around these corners. That will help get a really nice, neat finish on these corners. Okay, so I've sewn that on. As you reach to the corners, make sure that you leave your needle in and then lift up your presser foot to pivot. That's really important to making sure that you get a nice, neat finish. Now what we need to do is cut these center lines. So I'm going to use a craft knife because I find that that seems to be the best way for me to get a really nice, neat finish. Can use a pair of scissors as well. Now we need to get as close as we possibly can to these corners, but we don't want to snip the stitching. Okay, once that's done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this with my iron. So I'm going to press it from each direction and from the sides, and then I'm going to pull it through to the back. So now I've pressed that, I'm just going to pull this through to the back. And then I'm going to take it back to my iron again and press this just to get a really nice, neat finish all the way around. Okay, so this is how your facing should now be looking. It should be quite neat on both sides. Now we're going to attach the zip. So grab one of your pocket pieces and you want to place the zip so that it's closing to the left. So this should be right side up if you have a directional print. And your zip is going to be closing to the left. So just match it up to this top edge and clip it together. And we're just going to sew that with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you reach your zipper pull, just leave your needle in, lift the presser foot up, and then move the zip pull out of the way before continuing. Okay, so now grab your second pocket piece, and again you want this to be pointing upwards if you have a directional print, so it'd be the right way up. Now grab the free edge of the zip and you want to clip that to the top edge of that pocket, and just make sure that your pocket edges are lining up down the sides. And we're going to sew that with a 1/4 inch, scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so your zip will now be right side up on the wrong side of the fabric. Wrong side of the zip on the right side of the fabric. So to make this slightly easier to fit, I'm going to press this with the iron to get the zip to lay nice and flat. Now, if you're using something like waterproof canvas, you can just top stitch this edge down instead on both sides, and that will help it to lay flat. Okay, so that's pressed and it's lying a lot flatter. Now you want to have it so that the zip is closing to the left. And to make this even easier to fit, I'm going to put a bit of double-sided tape along the edges of the zip. You can use fabric glue if you prefer. And I'm just going to take the top off. Now we want to make sure that this is nice and centered. So what we're going to do is just secure the top down first. You want to make sure that you've got the same gap on each side up here so that the pocket is going to be centered. Right, once you're happy that's in the right place, you can take the second piece of double-sided tape off. And then just make sure that you're happy with the placement. You can always move it around if you need to, if it's not right first time. So once you're happy with that, we're going to sew around this box with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure that your pocket is completely open. So this one's up here, this one's down here, because otherwise you will sew your pocket closed. Okay, once that is done, you want to turn this over and fold the top piece down. Now what we're going to do is we're going to turn the whole bag through this. So we are going to fold the edges up and press them so that we've got like a nice neat finish afterwards. So what you want to do is just fold this shorter piece up by 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, whatever you fancy, and give that a press with the iron. And then we want to fold the underside to match. So I'm just going to put a couple of clips down the sides to make sure that they are kept together. I'll take that over to the iron and press both of those into place. Okay, so those are both pressed up so that they match, and I'm just going to add a couple more clips. And what we're going to do now is we're going to sew the sides but not the bottom. So I'm going to take it over to my machine and I'm just going to pull the main lining panel away and sew the sides. And make sure that you backstitch really well on this bottom edge because we're going to be turning the bag through there, so it will go through a little bit of pressure when we're doing that. Okay, so you may notice that I just happily sew over my zips. That's because these are nylon zips. They look like metal, but they are nylon, so you can just sew straight over them. If you're using metal zips, you will need to be a lot more cautious, and I would recommend like hand cranking over the teeth because you don't want to break a needle. So we're going to finish off the lining by placing our two lining panels right side together. And I'm just going to clip them together from top to bottom. So I'm going to sew the sides and the bottom edge with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Do not increase your seam allowance. The reason that we've got this sort of curve up here is because this is where the lining is tightened so that the lining fits perfectly. Sometimes with bags you can end up with like a saggy lining. That's because the lining needs to be smaller. So this lining is smaller than the exterior already. So if you increase your seam allowance, then you're going to have a lining that's too small. So make sure that you stick to a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're just doing the sides and the bottom. We're not touching the corners yet. Okay, so I recommend sewing this with the pocket facing up because otherwise this can get caught on the bed of your machine and then just cause you a lot of problems. Now the pocket is the right size, so you shouldn't be sewing through it when you're doing these seams. Now you'll notice I just backstitched and then jumped across on these corners. That's simply just so I don't have to keep cutting my threads. So there's not any other reason for it. So we need to box the corners, but first of all, what I'm going to do is press my seams open because that will help get a nice, neat finish for this bag. So I'm going to use an iron to press the seam all the way down each side and on the base. Okay, so now that I've pressed my seams open, I'm going to box my corners, same as we did for the exterior. We're just bringing this seam toward this seam, flatten that corner, and just clip it into place. Now again, I'm going to clip further down the sides because that will make it easier to stitch. It'll hold it all in place when we're at the machine. Okay, now I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to sew each of these box corners with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So both of your box corners should be sewn like that. Now I'm just going to trim these down a little bit just to help the lining fit a little bit better. Now the last thing I'm going to do is baste the seams open at the top. So I'm going to do this on both sides. This is just going to make it easier when we're top stitching later because this will lie completely flat without us having to worry about it. Okay, and that is your lining done. So step 5 is final construction. You're going to need the exterior of your bag, the lining, and you should also have your base stabilizer for later. Okay, so we need these to be right sides together before we sew them. So you can either put your exterior into your lining, but that is going to be awkward because the lining is smaller, or you can turn these out and that way we can put the lining into the exterior. So that's what I'm going to do. If you've got a fabric that doesn't like to be turned, that is one occasion when you might want to do it the other way around. The only thing that you need to be sure of is that these are right sides together, so the exterior and lining are going to have to be touching each other right sides together. So because we're going to open it through the pocket, you'll want to unzip your pocket now. Now, a lot of people panic if they forget to undo their zip. Don't ever unstitch anything if you've, forgotten to undo your zip. You can do it later. So I'm going to show you that later. So I'm going to leave mine done up for now, just so that I can show you how to undo it if you forget. But the simplest thing to do is just to unzip your zip right now. Okay, so lining right side out, exterior wrong sides out. We're going to put the lining into the bag. Now, it doesn't really matter which way around this goes. I mean, if you have a preference, then just remember that where the zip is pointing up, that's where the zip is going to be closed. So you might maybe want to have your zip pocket on the back or the front. It's totally up to you. I'm not bothered, so I'm just going to put mine in. And I'm going to match the center mark that we made on the exterior to this side seam of the lining. Okay, and then on the other side, I'm going to do the same thing and match the center mark on the exterior to the side seam of the lining. Now, the idea with this bag is that the exterior seams are here, the lining seams are over here. Because they're not matching, this is going to be a lot easier to stitch on a domestic machine because you're not going to have like layers and layers of bulk building up. So that's why the exterior seams are, off center. They're not on these sides, they're on the center. So just clip the rest of your bag together. Okay, now we need to sew the top. So I'm going to use a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is just less than a 3/8. What I like to do to make sure that I get a nice straight finish with my zip, I keep my standard presser foot on, I move my needle as far over as it will go, and then I just use the zip teeth as a guide. So it guides my presser foot, it keeps it going straight, and it gives me a really nice finish all the way around. So if you have the option to move your needle over, you can do that. Alternatively, you might need to use a zipper foot depending on your machine. Some people like to draw the seam allowance on before they go to make sure it's nice and neat. But just bear in mind that it is important to get a nice straight line all the way around, because otherwise your zip will look a bit messy, particularly if your zip is a colour that's different to your fabric and it's going to stand out. So I'll take that over to my machine. Again, this is easier on a domestic because I'm just going to take my table off and sew it like this. If you have a flatbed machine, you will need to do it from the inside instead. So now that's sewn, I'm going to turn my bag out through the pocket. Now, if you've forgotten to undo your zip, don't panic. So what you can do is grab the zip pull through the fabric. So this is going to be easier with thinner fabrics, more difficult with thicker fabrics, but I've never come across a zip that I can't get undone. So first of all, I just figure out which end my zip pull is on, so I can feel it on that end. And then I just grab the zip pull through there. And yeah, it's a little bit easier if you have remembered to do undo your zip, but I hate to see when people say that they've unpicked their bag because of it. So, okay, so you just grab it and you just kind of pull it through the fabric, and then you should be able to, from the inside, wiggle it the rest of the way using your thumb. And that's your zip open. So definitely don't unpick your bag if you've forgotten to undo your zip. Right, now I'm going to grab the exterior through this pocket and I'm going to pull it through. Okay, so again, the thicker your fabrics, the more difficult it's going to be. It's going to take you a little bit longer, but You can always do it. Burping the bag isn't always, you know, the easiest, but it can be done. Okay, so just push your corners out on your exterior. And then I'm going to put the pocket back in. And then I'm going to push my lining inside. So just spend a minute trying to get it all to sit flat. You might need to really pull your pocket through because it kind of bunches up, which then bunches up your lining. Okay, so we're going to top stitch this, but first what you might want to do is just check that your zip pull goes on, because if you've used too big of a seam allowance, so if you've used like a full 3/8 or slightly more, then you are really going to struggle. Okay, so your zip pull will go on absolutely fine if you have used 3/8 of an inch, a scant 3/8 of an inch. But I do just like to double check, because if for some reason your zip doesn't go on, you know, you're going to want to know that now before you top stitch. So once you've fed it in from each side, just push it down on a flat surface. I'm just going to have to twist this around. There we go. Okay, and you can see it does up no problem, but if you've used a much bigger seam allowance, then where it turns into the bag, you're going to have trouble getting your zip pull on. So that's why I just recommend checking it now. Now I'm loving this zip pull, but I actually think it's too big for this bag and it's not going to sit right. So I'm going to swap that out for another one. But first of all, we need to top stitch this. So what you need to do is spend a couple of minutes really pressing this fabric away from the zip. If you've got an iron handy and you've got, you know, cotton fabrics like I have, definitely get the iron out. Make sure that like the lining is sitting nicely there, everything's sitting flat, and you kind of want to press the fabrics away from the zip. So by doing this, we can make sure that we have a nice even gap like this around the whole of the top of the bag. So I'm just going to press mine with the iron, then I'm going to take it over to the machine, and I'm going to top stitch with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. When we get to the zip, make sure it's pointing up so that you're not sewing through these tails. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do once that's top stitched is put the base stabilizer in. Now it's up to you. You could use some glue or something to hold this in place, but I actually just wedge it in between the exterior and the lining, and I make sure that it's sat nicely between the box corners on that exterior. And that seems to just work great. So we need to sew up the bottom of our pocket. This is something I often forget to do on bags. So you're just going to pull your pocket out and you're going to match up those folded edges and clip together. And just sew that pocket closed with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, or slightly less if you can manage it. Now once your pocket is closed, you can shove that back in. And you'll need to just spend a moment like really pushing those corners down and making sure that the pocket is neat on the inside. Okay, so now we've got the part where you need to put your zip pull on for real. So I find it easiest to have it like this. And those marks that we made at the beginning, they should be pretty much lined up. So mine needs to be about like that. So I'm going to put this end in first because you can see that there's kind of one tooth longer on that side. So I'm going to put that in very slightly. Then I'm going to put the other side in. want my right hand side to be slightly higher, so you can see it is slightly higher. That looks about right to me. So then I'm going to put this on a flat surface, push down on the zip tape, and just pull the zip pull on. Okay, so now I'm happy with that. I'm going to twist my zip around, making sure the pull doesn't come off. Okay. And there you go. So what you want to do is just check that your end is looking nice and neat. Now, my lining did come up a little bit when I was top stitching it, so it's not as perfect as one of my others that I like, but there you go. Just make sure that your zip teeth are nice and equal. If one of them is longer than the other, take it off, start again. Don't worry if this takes you 2 or 3 attempts, it is absolutely fine. Just don't let zips stress you out. Just take your time with them. That's been my general rule. So I'm going to undo it quite a bit, and what we need to do is shove this through the tiny hole in the end. So you should have a tiny hole. If you've got a big hole, something's gone wrong. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of tuck it up, fold it up in underneath itself. And then I'm going to shove that through that hole. Now, this will take a minute because it is a really tight fit. But you should be able to grab it from the inside and then pull. There we go. And what it should do is basically, like, the zip seals the hole. So now there's no hole. Now, some of my testers, you might notice on their photos, they like to have their zip on the outside. That's fine if you prefer that. I prefer to have my zip hidden on the inside, so this is how I'm doing mine. Now, if you want to, you could trim this even shorter, but I'm going to leave mine at this length. I'm going to fold that in on one side. I'm going to fold the other side in. And then I'm going to put a zip end on. Now, in the pattern, there are instructions for doing a fabric one if you don't have a metal one. But I'm going to do a metal one. So I'm just going to shove that in. You can use a bit of glue as well if you want to. You can put the glue inside the zip pull, the zip end. And then grab your screwdriver and your screw. I'm going to put that on. Now, watch out because you don't want to slip and put the screwdriver through your hand. So just be really careful when you're doing this. Okay, and if you've got all your measurements right, your zip should go straight to the end, and then you just pinch that to pull it closed. So if you pinch the tops, it makes it nice and easy to pull closed. And you shouldn't have any problems with that at all. If you prefer to have your zip on the outside, that is fine. But once you've got that zip end on, you are not going to be able to get it through the hole. So, you know, you need to decide at this point which way around you want it. So the only thing left for me to do is to press this, get all of my wrinkles out, and attach my crossbody strap. Okay, so there is our finished bag. So I'm really hoping you guys like it as much as I do. I love this fabric from Spoonflower, and I just think it looks, I don't know, it looks kind of classic and nice. So you can see this isn't as structured as the Teloujay 1 and 2. It hangs brilliantly as a crossbody, but you know, it's not got the foam, so it's not as structured as the others if you've made the others in the past. But I'm really, really happy with how this turned out. I think it looks really nice, and hope you guys like it too. Let me know if you've got any questions, and make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we hope to see you really soon for our next video. Okay, hang on. Right, let's just do another one. Okay. Hi everyone, welcome back to Country Cow Designs. No, shouldn't have clapped my hand. Hi everyone. Stop laughing, it's my other.
Sorry.
Okay.